sort of the challenges and opportunities that come with attempts to convert hotels into affordable housing or housing, period. So we're joined by Noah, is it Kazis? Is that right, Kazi?
Kansas.
Kazis, didn't get it.
No one
From
does. It's not how it reads.
from the Furman Center, who is specifically focused on this subject, among others, I'm sure. But I think we'll kick off with Noah giving us some background and some insight into his research and what he's learned through his study. So,
Yeah, and all this research is with a whole team at the Furman Center, so credit to everyone where it's due. I'm gonna try and share my screen, and we'll see if this works. Can you all see that as a slideshow?
yep.
Great. So yeah, no, I'm really happy to be here because I think this is really one of the hot topics in New York City housing policy, and for really good reason. So there's a whole lot to talk about. So let's, if you could save questions just for the end, because I think otherwise we'll spend 20 minutes on the second slide. That's the experience I've had. There's just a lot of energy. So just to start off, this is a map that we put together. I can send around the link. It's an interactive map on
Noah,
our
before you
website.
jump in,
Yeah.
can you make it full screen?
Oh, I thought it was. Does that work?
Yes, we're good.
Great.
Thank you.
Yes, this is a map of hotels in New York City, zoomed in on you all. One thing you can see just about CB7 is you have old hotels, not new hotels. And I'm sure you know that just from lived experience, but the post-1961 map on the right looks pretty empty compared to the Midtown or the West Side. But there's a little more coverage for the older hotels. So that'll change sort of what the opportunities are for you all. But my presentation is going to be mostly focused on the whole city. And we can talk about how things are a little different in CB7 as we get to discussions. So I'm just going to go through this. We don't need to do it all now, but there's a lot of reasons that we're talking about this. There's things that make this a moment of opportunity, but it's not easy. And that's sort of the lesson I want to emphasize. There's a lot to seize, a lot of opportunities to seize, and a lot of challenges to overcome. And which one of those will predominate is going to depend. So one of the reasons there's an opportunity is that there's a political moment. This has been a major campaign promise of Mayor-elect Adams. He wants to convert 25,000 hotel rooms outside of Manhattan into housing. So outside of Manhattan means it's not entirely as relevant to you all, but also this is a chart we put together of where hotel rooms are in New York City. And you can see there's 124,000 hotel rooms in Manhattan, just 37,000 outside Manhattan. So if you're talking about a goal of 25,000, hitting it entirely outside Manhattan may not be feasible. That's a pretty substantial chunk of the entire outer borough hotel stock. So I suspect that as we continue to have this conversation, one thing we'll see is that, sort of the opportunity really is in Manhattan. And I'm just going to skip ahead for a second. It's really in Midtown. It's not to say that there aren't conversations to be had everywhere, including on the Upper West Side. But if you look at where hotels are, this is a map of all the large hotels. And this is a map that's a little harder to read of where hotels closed. We've got this data just from hotels.com, scraping it. It's Midtown. It's Midtown and to some extent downtown, Long Island City. But that is where the numbers are. So anything that we're talking about, think Midtown, 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 everywhere else. Anyway, so that's sort of one reason to think there's an opportunity here is the politics. Another, and the reason we're all talking about it, is value, right? There's an opportunity here to get housing for cheap. And the reason for that is you've got buildings that are standing up that are already used for shelter, right? That's what a hotel is. It's a place you can safely sleep. It has bathrooms, that has, at least a roof over your head, that's ready to go. So potentially, like, let's underscore that 6 times, you can save a lot of money compared to new construction. But whether you actually can is going to depend on a few things. And we could talk more about all of them, but it's going to depend on where the hotels are. It's going to depend on the regulatory requirements, which we'll dive into. It's going to depend on what you're converting it to, right? those hotel rooms that are existing shelter are not full apartments, right? They don't have kitchens, they don't have a lot of space. So whether you're actually able to save money or you're basically gutting the building really depends on what you want to change it to and what you have to change it to by law. But to underscore this point about value, in California, which is probably the state where they've most aggressively moved to turn hotels into housing during the pandemic, the average cost of a new affordable housing unit ground up was $425,000 before the pandemic. And the average cost when they did these conversions under their Project Home Key was the name, was $166,000. That's an enormous change in the amount of cost. That's not what you should expect in New York. We're not going to see hotel conversions come in at a third of affordable housing costs. California, they've got motels and extended stay hotels that already have, the right facilities or lots of space to do the construction. They were doing it at sort of the peak of the pandemic in 2020, whereas we're not. So we sort of missed the moment where hotels were truly empty. And California, I think this is really important, they just swept aside basically every zoning rule for these conversions. It was almost total regulatory relief. They swept aside environmental review. That's not what New York State has chosen to do. The major state intervention here is an act called HONDA that the state legislature passed, which provides money. So for certain eligible conversions to affordable housing, and there's additional requirements on top of that, it provides money, but it doesn't set aside the building code or the zoning code or any of those regulations. So you're not going to see what you get in California. And then returning to these maps, when you're thinking about cost, on the one hand, the conversion might be cheap in terms of what physical work you have to do, depending on the regulations, but you're also talking about sites that are in Midtown, which are expensive. This is not the normal map of where affordable housing is built in New York City. That's an opportunity, right? You're building affordable housing in places with access to jobs, in places with access to transit and all kinds of other amenities, but you also have to pay for doing that. So that's a trade-off to consider. I already mentioned the regulations do not make it easy to convert a hotel to housing. In the paper that we wrote, we go through some of the most significant ones, but there's 100 more that you could put behind it. Can you build you can build hotels in industrial zones. You can't build residences. There's different bulk requirements. There's different window requirements. There's different density requirements. There's different safety requirements. Sometimes these line up and it's feasible to do the conversion with minimal renovations, but not usually, right? So for the average hotel, if there weren't any regulatory relief, you're either talking about going through a ULURP or just keeping the skeleton of the building and starting over. On the bottom of the slide, I just say conversion to what, because the different regulations, you're going to have a very different pathway if you're building market rate housing, if you're building affordable housing, if you're building supportive housing, or if you're converting to a shelter. Each of those is going to have sort of different opportunities just as a matter of regulation before you even get to financing. And I wanted to take a step back for a second and say, why are there all these regulations? And it really is sort of a core story of the history of New York City housing, which used to have very thin lines between long-term housing and short-term housing, right? You have boarding houses and rooming houses and lodging houses and SROs and all these different ways of maybe you're renting a room by the night, maybe you're renting a bed by the night, maybe you're renting it by the week. But what was a hotel and what was housing was those weren't entirely separate categories. I have some pictures here from sort of the turn of the century, and you can see conditions might have been Spartan. They might have been, a little bit homey, but quite small, or they might have been really people, bunk to bunk. And the housing reformers of the day 100 years ago really thought this was not suitable and started to separate over time short-term housing and long-term housing, hotels and what we call housing. I think we've paid a price for that. There's also been important benefits to housing quality, but one of the things that I think this project and this opportunity raises, just for some food for thought, is that maybe there was something good to have that layer of housing that was a little more flexible, more affordable. If there are ways to bring back some of those middle grounds, I think it's a conversation that it's probably time to have. But that's sort of my historical aside. So some other things that sort of make this is it a moment of opportunity or is it a challenge? Going back to the regulatory issues, some of them are city law, some of them are state law, like the multiple dwelling law. So you've got a conflict between city and state authority over who's going to actually sort of be involved in facilitating any conversions. You need city and state cooperation, or maybe the state's just going to throw some elbows and steamroll the city and say, this is what we're doing. And as you know, whenever there's city-state politics, it gets complicated. So we'll see how that all plays out, especially with two new administrations. Tourism, when this conversation started, hotels were empty. I mean, they were just totally empty, right? People weren't traveling. They weren't traveling for work. They weren't traveling for fun. It was practically illegal to do so in many situations. That's not entirely the case anymore, but we don't really know what the future holds. So this is just a projection from the state comptroller. Who knows if this will turn out to be right, but one idea of what's going to happen is we're going to see pretty fast recovery of leisure travel and slower recovery of business travel as people take remote meetings like we're doing right now. If that's true, you might see some hotels recover quickly, some hotels recover much more slowly based on location and business model. But you have to make that kind of prediction to see where are the opportunities, are there opportunities? And sort of along with that is this question of jobs, right? When you're talking about converting hotels to housing, you get housing, but you lose a hotel. And that hotel is important both for the jobs at the hotel and then also for the broader hospitality sector that hotels really support, whether that's restaurants or tourism or all of that. And this has been a big political issue. I think there's a lot of political support for hotel jobs, which are in Manhattan, often unionized, and just generally sort of for the importance of tourism and hospitality to the city. This is a graph of employment in the hospitality industry, and you can see it's down like 30% from pre-pandemic, unlike in the rest of the country, which is that top line where it's almost recovered back to exactly where it was pre-pandemic. So those kinds of job losses from one side of the coin is, okay, that's why the buildings are empty. That's why there's an opportunity. But from the other side of the coin, those are people who want their jobs back and whose families need those jobs back. And then all the things that supports coming out from there. Sort of building off of that, here in New York, we missed the moment of sort of the true emergency. Does that mean that the opportunity is gone? No. But does it mean the opportunity is different? Probably yes. There's a question of sort of what are the politics of hotels to housing conversions? Something you guys obviously have a lot of experience with in certain contexts, but is there going to be local pushback? Is there going to be local pushback on certain uses, but not other uses? Are we going to end up with a lot of hotels in some hotels that are converting in some neighborhoods, but not others, which may pose fair housing concerns if it's all in industrial neighborhoods without, access to certain amenities? And then sort of, this is just maybe the last question to my mind is the opportunity worth it, right? So there's a lot of challenges. And going back to those regulatory challenges, I just want to reiterate, they are thorny. There are just a million tiny rules, each of which could be the difference between a project that is completely infeasible and one that works. So there are ways to get through that thicket, but they may not be worth it in terms of sort of our collective effort as a city, as citizens, as advocates, as for elected officials times. Is it better to focus on converting offices that are empty, or is it better just focus on new construction? One thing that I think prompted some of our research was that early on in this conversation, I think there was a sense that hotels might be a free lunch, right? There were these empty buildings that could be converted to housing, or we could solve all of our problems at once because the hotels weren't coming back, or they weren't coming back at any time that we cared about. We need housing desperately. The buildings are already there, so you don't have to have a fight about how tall is too tall, how dense is too dense. And that was maybe it was realistic or not at the time. It's not realistic now, right? Like there are real trade-offs that we have to make. And I think it's important to be clear-eyed that hotels offer real opportunities, but they are not sort of a way around the difficult questions about housing policy, whether it's how to fund housing, where to build housing, how much housing we need, of what kinds, like all of those questions that you guys deal with regularly. They're as acute in the hotels to housing context, and they don't diminish the need to have that conversation more globally. So it's just sort of useful to say, like, this is a super important conversation to be having, but we don't want it to be sort of a substitute for all the other important conversations we have to be having. So it's one piece of the puzzle, is sort of the point to end on. And with that, let me stop the sharing and we can jump into conversation.
Great. Thanks for that. Very informative and thought-provoking. Do folks want to ask questions? All right, Robert, you're on.
It's yeah, that was a wonderful survey and very informative. Then it's not a question, but it's just I'd like you to opine. The number of new hotels, these boutique hotels that are going up, that have been going up in Midtown, I mean, a lot of them, unless I'm overlooking, whatever demand there might have been for these obsolete hotels has been completely eradicated by these new hotels. And which makes it even that more imperative to choose the existing hotels for conversion. Am I exaggerating the impact of these new hotels? And they're going up on 36th Street, 28th Street, 27th Street, in the Garment District. They're just shooting up. And so how do you see that development, to me, massive development? Again, I might be exaggerating.
No, you're not at all.
Having an impact on the policy that we're trying to formulate.
Yeah, so I don't remember the number off the top of my head, but a really staggering percentage of total hotel rooms in New York have been built in the last 20 years, mostly in exactly the neighborhoods you're talking about, often in industrial zones. And that's really changed the market dramatically. New York is still arguably, or was arguably prior to the pandemic, still relatively low in the number of hotel rooms for the amount of demand there was for tourism and travel. You know, it's just an international and national destination. So I wouldn't say it necessarily obsoleted the existing hotels, but it transformed the market. Right. And that those hotels are designed somewhat differently. They have smaller rooms, but they also are more up to date in terms of things like accessibility codes for people with disabilities. So which ones are sort of a better target for conversion is really hard to say as a blanket matter. Some of the older hotels will be much more easy to convert, maybe because they have bigger rooms, or maybe because they're just not that marketable as a hotel anymore. And some of the newer ones will be easier to convert because they're new, right? Like they don't need as many repairs. They're up to contemporary standards. So we thought that we would see or hear from, industry stakeholders that one or the other was the target for conversion. And the conclusion we came to is that it's a much more site-by-site analysis. The other thing to sort of throw in the mix of how is demand going to change and how is supply going to change over the next however long is they just enacted this special permit requirement for new hotel construction. That's going to make it substantially more difficult to build new hotels. The magnitude we'll find out, but on the margin, it's certainly going to be a brake, not an accelerant to new hotel construction. That probably is going to make it, at least in the short term, harder to convert hotels to housing, because it's one thing to say, well, we'll turn this hotel to housing because this one isn't really doing that well as a hotel, but there'll be more hotels that come in the future. But if you think it's hard to add a new one, that existing hotel, it's much more valuable as a hotel than it was before, at least until we learn how everything shakes out, how the council is going to treat the special permit requirement, all of that stuff. So yeah, there's a lot of uncertainty about how sort of the boom and then the reaction to the boom in hotel construction affects sort of the stock in the market generally.
Do you think it's almost as if the hotel on this in Billionaires Road, the Park something hotel on 60th Street, it looks like it's the beta hotel for conversion. Have you paying close attention? I haven't been able to get the pictures of what they're doing inside.
I haven't seen that one. Are they converting to market rate apartments?
It's a shelter.
Oh, the shelter.
They got
Yeah.
a lot of play, and so that is that going to be the standard, the flagship for what we're looking to do in other parts of Midtown?
Yeah, I don't know. It could be. I just don't know that site well enough. We've seen a lot of conversions to shelters pre-COVID. During COVID, we've seen a lot of conversions to market rate housing pre-COVID, not so much during COVID. Well, we haven't seen as many conversions to affordable housing that is, non-shelter, just given the way the market has gone, but none by any means. Some to supportive housing, that's more common than non-supportive affordable housing. So there's a lot of different pathways, and it's really about finding the right mix of location, existing building, who wants to sell and who wants to buy and who's got the funding. It's surprisingly hard to generalize, with the one exception that old hotels that are rent stabilized have a clearer pathway to conversion to supportive housing. That's sort of one category where I can say, as a category, like there's sort of a match between existing design, existing regulations, and a future use. Other than that, it's hard to make too many generalizations.
What makes you say that? Oh, sorry, Robert. What makes you say that about supportive specifically? I'm just curious, like what pathway? Is it just that there's precedent, or is it?
Yeah, it's DOB precedent. It's like kind of complicated, and it's some of what we were talking about in our prep meeting, that the changes in interpretation. It's not worth talking about here, but there are potentials there. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Sorry, Robert, I cut you off. But Susan, if you want to jump in.
Thanks. I just want to mention my rent stabilized building. Actually, my rent stabilized apartment in my building. Our building was a hotel in the 1920s, and it's exactly what you're talking about, where it was turned into rent stabilized units in 1970s. The landlord bought it, and now, unfortunately, only about 303 units, only about 30 remain as rent stabilized apartments.
Very interesting.
It's horrifying.
I think the Upper West Side is like it's one of the places where sort of along with Midtown, sort of where the lines between hotel and housing have been most fluid and contested over time. I mean, I think that there's probably a lot of people in this conversation whose buildings have one version of the story or another.
Other questions? If not,
Yes.
I see Ethel has her hand
Oh,
up.
sorry, I didn't see your physical
Oh,
hand.
sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you. The Upper West Side has historically been particularly interesting in the conversion from so-called conventional housing units to SRO units and buildings, with at some point after World War II, a little before World War II and then after World War II, there was a very major conversion of residential buildings to SROs. And then more recently, in the last 20 to 25 years, the conversion went back again to residential hotels. And the Upper West Side was, as a neighborhood, and as the fact of this this great conversion, then another conversion, and so on. And then there was a time, as many know, that the SROs did house hundreds and thousands of poor people, and particularly those who were thrown out of mental institutions, but with the guarantee that they were going to get good housing, and instead the SROs became important, but warehouses. And then there was a conflict. And then as things got more prosperous, back to the residential. My point now is, as I have been reading, and I mean, by the way, the Committee Board 7 was very active in the work, the advocacy, the analysis, and I happen to be one of those who did a lot of writing on it, and eventually was able to work on developing the whole study on SRO's housing. Now I understand, I'm told that the bad rep for SROs is now somewhat being alleviated, and that many, or some at least, are advocating a renewal of SROs, hotel, like for low-income people, with a couple of major differences. And because the zoning, would permit 6 rooms and 1 bathroom, I mean, that 1 bathroom for 6, and that's not acceptable now. But there, I believe, and I think it could be that it needs to be studied, though it's very difficult, that a renewal and change in the zoning and some of the regulations for the development of SROs, but with better conditions, and certainly not, the 1 bathroom for 6, can be a worthy policy, and actually one which can begin to help the needs of developing housing in a hotel-like setting, but for lower income and moderate, income people, and that is being studied. I'm not sure how realistic it is, but it is extremely interesting, important, and not impractical, and maybe answering a valid need, not solving it, but at least that is possible given the nature of the housing and the possibilities.
Yeah, well, I think that history is extremely important, and
extremely, yeah.
Yeah, I think especially for your neighborhood, just key to understanding the context. And speaking only for myself, I count myself among those who think that sort of a modern SRO would be a valuable addition to New York City's housing stock, which is to say that it served a need for some people, whether because of their particular sort of labor market status or transitioning out of, correctional institutions or health institutions, of one kind or another. It isn't being served right now. And if you can find a way to sort of add that bottom rung to the ladder of housing back in a way that is better regulated and less abused, I think that would add an important component to sort of the broader housing stock. Just one fact that I'm always struck by: in the 1980s, a sort of homelessness really spikes in New York City for the first time. Really, they did a study where they asked people where they were coming from. Half of shelter entrants in the 1980s said they were coming from an SRO that closed.
That's correct.
So as this stock, it sort of disappears, it directly leads to the homelessness crisis that has really lasted from then until now. But prior to the 80s, it looked really different because there was this stock of very low cost, very low quality housing that some people were able to move up out of when it disappeared, and some people moved down. So yeah, I'm with you. Just speaking only for myself, this is something that if there's a way to crack the code and figure out how to do it with quality controls, that would be a good thing.
Ethel, you're on mute if you're speaking.
I'm sorry. I just want to add that we actually have this on the Upper West Side because some very, very important studies were done. I'll just give you 2 facts, and it's worth it because it's you can learn an enormous amount of what has been the case in our neighborhood over 30 years. And one was that the SROs did serve a need and a purpose by housing many low-income single people, but sadly, it coincided in the 70s and 80s with the closing of the institutions, and then the dumping of the people there into SROs, often being run by for-profit landlords who were not the greatest and exploited them. And then it really became, it was terrible, though they needed the housing, but the government never provided enough money and services. And then you are quite right, because we have the information statistically that then people were, there was another conversion, and it did lead in many ways directly to an increase in homelessness. And the Upper West Side saw that occurring on the streets. And that whole thing was horrible and tragic, and a violation of what was intended to be decent public policy. Close the big institutions, which were warehousing, provide people with housing in SROs, and provide services. But it didn't work that way, and the people suffered. And then the community here was very upset with the change and homeless in the street, and didn't understand, of course. So the Upper West Side has shown the best and some of the most difficult trends, but we can, I think, learn a lot in a good way.
I think that's right. Couldn't have said it better.
Jeanette,
Thank you.
Jeanette, do you want to ask a question?
Sure. Building off of Ethel's comments, I agree that we've kind of gone from like perfect is the enemy of good, where because we can't build housing, affordable housing with all these standards, the alternative is people live on the street, that it would be nice if we had some different levels there. But on the other side of the spectrum, I know that a lot of the hotels that are not in great neighborhoods for social services or other things, or a lot of these hotels that were built in industrial areas got turned into temporary housing for homeless families or such. And I totally understand that, but I also know that the services that these residents needed, especially if a hotel's in an industrial area, were not available, or the adjacent uses were not compatible with the residents, or the residents were not compatible with the adjacent, use or such. And while you gave a very comprehensive overview of the issue, what I think might be helpful is if there was, and I don't know, maybe I missed this because I missed the first couple slides, but some kind of basic criteria that said if a hotel is going to be used for housing temporarily or longer term, at a minimum, it should have these components, structurally, like spatially, with regard to whatever the bathroom ratio is, but also that it should have these neighborhood amenities, access to the subway, or there should be a nonprofit social service agency that's servicing it. I think a lot of our issues with the SRLs came when they were privatized, pretty much, because you can't serve the population if your bottom line is to make money. And so that definitely is, it's so I guess just in conclusion, what I'd like to know, do you think hotels are one component of solving the affordable housing issue? And if so, what should that criteria be? I think that would be helpful. I mean, you don't have to answer that now, but that's just my thought.
No, I think that's really the crux of the question, right? Which is to say, we have all these rules that make it so that you can't convert hotels to housing. And if we keep all of them, we're not going to be able to use this as one of the as a significant way of adding to our housing stock or our affordable housing stock. On the other hand, if you got rid of all of them, you probably would lead to housing in conditions and locations that you do not want. Which combinations work and which combinations work at what cost is really hard. And it's gonna vary, right? I actually think there's probably not one checklist, right? Because people are willing to make trade-offs, and we all do that in our own housing choices. Some people are willing to live in a much smaller place to live in the neighborhood they want, and some people make a very different choice. And people with lots of choices make that trade-off. And so there's a lot of different permutations that could be quality housing for people. Some people, this is something that I was really struck by during the pandemic, is there was a set of people who wanted to live in converted hotels that were being used as homeless shelters, who wouldn't live in sort of a dormitory style shelter because they valued their privacy enough that they were willing to live on the street rather than live in a dormitory style shelter, but were happy to live in a hotel room. Now, that's not everyone. Other people really suffered for being disconnected from services, but there's just a lot of different housing needs out there. Different neighborhood, and how you sort of mix and match the people that are living in housing to the design of the housing, to the location of the housing, to the funding that you have, to the funding that you wish you had. I don't think you can have an off-the-shelf solution. Probably, maybe. I think there actually probably are a few rules in the building code, the zoning code, that you could just sweep away. That just were passed in 1950, whatever, are no longer relevant. That is a tiny number. Mostly, I think that the way people are thinking about this is maybe we can identify sort of the key barriers, and we can find ways to sort of, in a site-specific way, allow either applications for waivers or something like that that sort of allows some customization to both the population being served, the location, the building, the funding stream. Because I think the checklist is like a very noble idea, and probably we would spend 5 years making the checklist before we were able to do anything. And then by that point, we need a new checklist because conditions had changed. But I think that the underlying question is exactly right, which is what are we willing to trade off?
Okay, Ira and Jeanette, you were done, right? Or
Yeah. Okay, I have two comments. One is, Noah, what you just talked about is the parallel to what was done under the loft law, which was 7C of
exactly.
New York State multiple dwelling law. You could create that in one legislative session. It could be in place by next June, and then you'd be amending it in 3 years or 5 years. That's easily doable. It was and you could even create it, I wouldn't say loft board, but you pick the name and you set up a process, and you get around a lot of the regulatory hurdles doing that. And that's the way to do it. And if you have a mayor and a legislature that want to agree, it can be done. Once again, the problem is the catchment for it, and the catchment for lofts has been fairly limited as well since that was created. But it's the loft board has still exists, and it still functions. And every few years they create another catchment area for the loft law, and so that mechanism is not going away. And the reason that's leading to my next question is there is the time element here. In CB7, we have two buildings. One is starting construction and one is finishing construction. The one that's finishing construction is 108th Street. Everybody here is hopefully fairly familiar with that one. I know one person that's at least as familiar with it as I am. Hi, Ethel. It is transitional, supportive, and affordable housing in a single building. The construction of that building has been a relatively short timeline. The timeline to get to that construction was infinitely long. Similarly, there's a building on 96th Street that's about to start construction, which is approximately half compact units, and that's a private developer. The catch is, and that is also an infinitely long timeline as well. Those were both public sites, had to go through ULURP, had to finance. I won't go through the whole story. I think, I believe Ethel is also, as well as that, as the rest of us, are very familiar with it. But these are both exactly what you're talking about in terms of new construction. And the reason those probably work from an economic point of view is that they use public land. Unfortunately, the time element is hideous. And when I think about the number of people that could have gone through the transitional program in the 10 years it took to get that building open, or the number of supportive units that could have been housed with literally generations of seniors while that worked its way through the process is unspeakable. So with that, we have to look at the time element here. And despite all of the other problems we have, we don't control much land for any kind of public process in most of the city anymore. So that's a problem. But we really have to look at the time element. And I think you have to calculate the time element into what is a hotel. Even if you take an existing building and demolish it, it takes you anywhere from a year to 2 years to get that building available as a site for new construction, unless you have vacant land to start with. And that has to get, and once again, you have to calculate this. I don't need to tell you what to do. You know what the whole development process is. So taking a hotel might still be the most time effective and potentially the most cost effective, even if you have to strip it back, because it's a vacant building to start with. And that's a frightening prospect because you just went through all the other limitations. So it goes back to create Article 7D.
Yeah, no, and I think you're exactly right to say that those are one question, even though they seem like they have two parts, because something like the loft law is the only way to do it fast. And if you're not doing it fast, for all the reasons you said, you're not solving a problem soon, and you're adding all the costs associated with time. In the negotiations over the law that became Honda, which is, I mentioned, doesn't provide that kind of regulatory relief, but does provide money, there were a lot of drafts that came out. And some of the leading proposals in that legislation and other legislation borrowed almost directly from the loft law, just saying, we'll change you don't even have to change the certificate of occupancy, you just can use the hotel as housing tomorrow, basically. So I think that is at least a model that is out there. It is one option for sort of how to do this legislatively, but it didn't pass. Right. So it's a little bit hard to think that if you run the play again through the legislature, it'll come out all that differently. But I wasn't on the inside of that, so I don't know, was it close, was it not close? But you could see in all the different, in all the different versions of all the different legislation, some would say, okay, we'll allow it, but we'll only allow it in Manhattan. And someone would say, no, we'll only allow it outside of Manhattan. We'll only allow it for big hotels, we'll only allow it for small hotels, we'll only allow it in a residential zone, or maybe we'll allow it up to 400 feet outside a residential zone. And I think that those questions of catchment that you were raising, there wasn't consensus. And because it is such a potentially fast and comprehensive form of regulatory relief, there wasn't the consensus for how or where to apply it.
Well, just to finish quickly.
Yeah.
Last month we had Linda Rosenthal as our guest, and a couple of us, myself particularly, half laughed at the idea of $100 million going much of anywhere in New York and New York State as a whole in 2022. But she expected that this was going to get revisited in the next legislative session, hopefully, maybe. But we also have a new mayor coming in who is perhaps more committed, maybe. So maybe gets revisited. Maybe we have to wait until 2023. But once again, it goes back to the time element. And at the same time, with the time element, you have to offset it with the costs of temporary housing and the social costs of certain groups being unhoused for another year or 2 or 3 or whatever. So I'll put it that and give my the next question.
Yeah, that's super important and dead on.
Louisa, you're on.
Okay. I have so many questions. I have yellow stickies all over here. Okay, I would first like to focus on Community Road 7 on the Upper West Side. And the thing is that we have a lot of old buildings, some hotels, some of them just kind of old and empty. People talking about temporary housing. I always thought about permanent housing because eventually homeless or people who've been evicted, etc., have to move into permanent housing. And I know that my daughter used to live in a building that had been a hotel, and it was a series of rooms, and people had bought adjoining rooms and connected them, and the floor plans were weird and wonderful. First of all, what is our population? What is it? Who is it that we want to house? Are we talking about seniors? Are we talking about homeless guys? Are we talking about homeless families? Because I think the solutions sometimes are different for this. What I want to know really is who is doing this? What nonprofit? Because I think, as Jeanette said, the for-profit, we don't want to deal with for-profit entities because they're not going to serve the public. But what nonprofits are pursuing this now? Is there anybody?
Yeah, there have been some very great hotel to housing conversions, both historically and some deals that are being pursued more recently by.
Who is doing them?
Oh, so the one that I've dealt the most with is Breaking Ground, but there's a number. It's not like a huge quantity because until recently the market wasn't there for that many hotels to be on the market. Demand was high for hotel rooms, but yeah, this is something that's, I think, some of the leading, supportive housing providers in the city have been quite active in pursuing. So I don't think you have to worry that there aren't people ready to seize the opportunity if the stars align, but that's a big if.
Okay, well, what can we do as a community board?
Hmm.
I mean, we learned about this, we listened to people like you, for which I'm so appreciative, but I think we'd like to do something. And we're not really sure what we can.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think we see our role as advocates in some ways and able to potentially, have a little more muscle to encourage our elected officials to take on issues. And I guess if you had to make your regulatory relief wish list, that would encourage, it sounds like we're all kind of thinking about affordable housing specifically in this case.
Yeah.
What would be what you would prioritize in terms of policy changes that need to happen?
Yeah, I think that sort of the conversation we were having in response to Ira's question is what I would point to, which is something that is not rule by rule, line by line analysis, because I just don't think it's feasible. Like I've been in some of these conversations where people have tried to say exactly, we're going to make this exact change to section 262077 or whatever it is. And I don't think you can get from here to there in a time frame that will lead to you ever getting there. I don't think it's a possible path. So I think what you need to do is find some category that you're willing to say, this pretty close to approximates where we're trying to allow this, and it might not be 100% perfect, but is close enough, and say, this is going to be a fast process. It's going to be a fairly as of right process. Doesn't have to be totally as of right, but like something that is, I think you have to go fast, and you have to go sort of, I don't want to say hammer and not scalpel, because that's not quite right, but some tool that's in between.
But isn't everybody talking about hotels? One of the reasons that they are is they seem to come ready-made. I mean,
The
there
problem
are
is they're not as ready-made as they look. There are a
Ah.
small number of hotels, very, very small, where they approximate ready-made. But the New York hotel stock isn't like some other places where they are. So I mentioned Breaking Ground, and they have a project in Brooklyn and Dumbo where they were able to do one-to-one conversions into supportive housing at a hotel that had previously been owned by the Jehovah's Witnesses. The reason they were able to do that in part is that those rooms were enormous because the Jehovah's Witnesses were, it wasn't really a commercial hotel, right? It was a residential hotel that was sort of classified as a commercial hotel. This is all kind of within that community. So it was like what an extended stay hotel would be, though it just wasn't formally that. And as a result, they could do sort of a very minor set of changes to the building structure, and each room became an apartment. They still need to go through ULURP, notably. There are not many hotels like that. There are very, very few hotels where you could just do sort of that kind of one-to-one off the shelf without changing our standards, our legal standards for what a residence is. So you're talking about either big construction or big regulatory change, or some combination of the two. And where you make that trade-off between we're going to do more extensive renovations or more extensive regulatory changes is, I think, the conversation you have to have about what we're going to do with hotels, if anything. And nothing seems like a perfectly plausible prediction for what we'll do. But that's sort of what Ira, I think, was getting at, is to do less physical renovation, you need to do more wholesale legal change faster.
Okay, but if we're dealing with, say, homeless single people, of which there are many, it seems to me that hotels, especially because they usually have a dining room, they have large kitchens, it works.
It can. And I think that is the right ambition to have. But I think we saw a lot of conflict over attempts to use hotels as housing for formerly homeless people, recently. I think there's complaints among service providers about their ability to put in sort of the social services that they might want to. There's concerns about accessibility standards for people with physical disabilities, different framework. It's so close, and I think your instinct is just dead on. There is a way to make this work, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. I think it's just dead on, but it is not as easy as it ought to be, for reasons good and bad. And bad.
Any other questions before we let our terrific panelists go, and then we can continue discussion whether we want to write a resolution or take next steps. Louisa,
Can we just ask Noah if you could send us the presentation? I would love to be able to really look at those statistics. That would be terrific.
Yeah, I'll send you the presentation, I'll send you our report, and I'll send you our mapping tool.
Perfect. Thank you.
I just want,
I just want to add, it might not be a bad thing for the members of this committee to look at the big report produced by Community Board 7 on SROs some years ago, and subsequently the report that was published by the New York State Department of Social Services, which did a detailed analysis of the needs, the demographics, the buildings of I think 8 or 10 hotels on the Upper West Side and something like 1,200 residents, and made many policy recommendations and some zoning and building recommendations, some of which got passed. And that's history, but it could be looked at. It's all Upper West Side buildings, information, and history. and it's not bad.
All right, well, I should run, but thank you all for having me. This was actually just a great conversation, and it was really my pleasure. And I'll send you those materials. Thank you all.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you very
Ellen.
much.
Have a good night and a good Thanksgiving.
Bye.
Thank you.
All right, so I guess now I want to put it to the committee. You know, what next steps do we want to take? Is this something we want to write a resolution about? Is this something we feel like we need to research and digest more before doing so? Just want to open the floor for discussion.
I think the first question for us is, do we want to do something that is a policy statement citywide, or do we want to do something that is specific to CB7? And to me, that's the threshold question for us, because it's really it's harder for us to do something that's CB7 specific, because if you look at a lot of our hotels that are in our district, a lot of those actually are owned by nonprofits today. So that's one thing. And it's kind of funny because we've had this discussion before, and I don't think even members of this committee are aware of the depths of the nonprofit ownership of the hotels in CB7. I think we've been relatively effective as a city bringing, at least within CB7, the changes that Ethel talked about happening in the past. And some of them are still happening today. For example, Project Find is taking over another hotel. And that one has been, and I think, the group that just left the Lucerne is doing another facility in the neighborhood, which we also talked about more on the transitional side. So there are a lot of things that are happening. What I did want to mention before our speaker left was that there have been a series of patches over the years, not just the loft law. There's Article 67, the multiple dwelling law, which was done generations ago. There are all sorts of patches that have been done in the regulatory structure to accommodate changes in actual housing. And the problem with the MDL is we're stuck with the New York State legislature, and some Looney Tune in Jamestown or Ogdensburg gets to vote on this stuff. So, so be it. Yeah, they also may be perfectly nice people too, and sometimes supportive of us, and not to belittle Ogdensburg. But the question to me is, if we want to do something, what is our audience? And I leave that open to everybody, because we could argue that one all night.
Well, let me ask, is there some kind of survey of hotel ownership, specifically on the Upper West Side? What we need now is an intern. This is a quick study that an intern could do. Yeah, Ethel?
Well, an answer to that particular question, I think that could be obtained quickly. I would say or venture in asking about a policy statement or resolution. Number one, I would immediately say, let's not just pass a resolution. That's the easiest thing in the world. And we don't know any, and it's just saying, you know, like motherhood or something. And I don't know who the audience is. To me, it would be helpful, more than helpful, to get some facts in our neighborhood. How many hotels are there? What do the agencies tell us? And they do it every time they ask for money and every time they ask to get another facility. That's not a bad thing, but and say this is needed. We all assert, and we know it, that there's hundreds and maybe more on the street, homeless. And then we think we know something about, are there 10 providers and 10 hotels? But there's little that is coherent. And we could at first, get some facts of today, with a few variables, how many hotels run by not-for-profits, how many people, I mean, some of this, and because we all know it by intelligence, but we never get it presented in a way that's accessible to us as people living in the community and who sometimes have to act to approve something. So I would do that with a 3-month time frame, maybe get an intern, set up what did we like to know, what do we need to know that's doable, and set that. And there are a few people who even here talking have a lot of knowledge, and I think it would be a starting point at least to be sharing what's going on now in the Upper West Side, and what are we talking about, and we can do that.
This is a perfect opportunity to go back to Furman again, where we've had so much luck. When I came on the board in 2012 in housing, we had the student from Furman, and he did that survey of the SROs of the Upper West Side. It's got
Wait, Noah was, just so we're all clear, Noah was from Furman, who we just spoke with us.
Oh, I'm sorry. Then, yeah, but that was Furman at the time. And he did, Daniel or David something, he did a beautiful job, very thorough job. And, we applauded him. And it was the survey, the CB7 of the SROs and the whole thing. And we should be able to dig that up out of the archives and put it to work, as Ethel and others are saying, and Louisa, and just get the update and get the ownership component.
It's not only the ownership.
Trying to do this. Yeah.
Hi, Robert. I'm gonna actually disagree with a lot of what's been said, and folks are free to disagree with me, but I feel like we're like reinventing the wheel. Furman has just spent all this time looking at hotels and pointing to where there's the most opportunity. There is some opportunity in the Upper West Side. It seems rather limited. I think, spending more time digging into just how limited it is, I don't know how worthy that is of our time and energy, and putting someone to work doing it, because I don't know how that would better inform like our actions subsequently. Like, would it just be that we have more data points in the resolution that point to that there's not a lot of opportunities in the Upper West Side? Because then, like, how is that helpful? Or is it that we then just decide it's not worth opining at all on the issue? I guess in my mind, I think looking at it in a citywide lens makes more sense, because though we might not have a lot of opportunity, when homelessness is exacerbated by a lack of housing, it leads to us having potentially like more homeless shelters or more folks on the street. So, the opportunities may not be here, but the secondary impacts are here. So I guess I feel like, I'm all for taking a beat and putting more thought into what a useful resolution should be and what policy specifically it should advocate for. But I don't know that digging in with more research is necessarily the most helpful tack, but that's my opinion.
I just respectfully disagree. I don't think we're talking about abstract research. I think we have responsibilities, and we want to know more, and we do act on information in relation to Community Board 7. Of course, we need to know about the entire city, and we act on that. But, and I really don't think that the goal is to write a resolution. That's easy to do. To me, a goal in a way is for all of us to learn more and understand more of what are some of the facts, which we together should say, what do we need to know more, even though we have been passing resolutions about what exists in our community. How many hotels, what are they, what was on, who is being served, what block, some of that could take 2 months to do or less. And we could know more about this and get a real sense of maybe more information about the housing and the people that we all pass every day and that we sometimes act on. I mean, this could take, 2 months, and we would have some information And it wouldn't be everything, but we would at least be able to know a little more about what has been happening or what we do see around us in our community. To me, at least, that would be informative and helpful. And then we could try to move in a way that all of us think could be helpful.
I'm just going to pause and call on one of the attendees who's had their hand up for a while. Okay, Rochelle, you should be able to unmute. Rochelle, can you unmute?
I did
There you go.
not have my hand up, actually.
Oh, you did not have your hand up? Sorry, it's hard to hear you.
Yes.
Okay, I guess. Sorry, back to the committee discussion.
Mark
So,
hasn't spoken yet.
oh, Mark, did you have your hand up? Yeah, please go.
Well, I'm not on the committee, so I want to defer to those who know the stuff better. I would put in a small plug for the nerd part of this, and because of course that's where I live. And the nerd part of this is trying to figure out exactly what structural impediments would need to be changed from either a legislative or regulatory standpoint. I think that the presentation tonight started to touch on those, but we didn't get too granular in it. If we could figure out what those things are, that could be either a part of a resolution or a part of an advocacy position. But instead of saying, you know, supportive housing good and homeless shelters problems or whatever it might be, saying, in effect, fix this aspect of the infrastructure or the legal infrastructure, and you have an opportunity to have a meaningful conversation. That might be a useful thing that we could do to bring high. There are lots of advocates on all sides of this issue. This might be something useful we can do, and then get our electeds, you know, involved in that part of the conversation as well. That's my thought.
Yeah,
Interesting.
sorry, I'm gonna jump. I agree with that in terms of I don't want to not know what the problems are and just speak off the cuff and write something generic. It sounds like Ethel's very much not a fan of like, we need to do this and not have more details. So I do think it would be good to dig into what Noah shares with us. And I do think Furman's already done a lot of the research and there's like very detailed papers laying out what all the issues are, and we would do well to educate ourselves. So agree. Sorry, Louise, I cut you off. Robert, do you want to?
Yeah, I think that to go back to my original thought, that if we updated that report that we had from 2012 on the SROs and add in the acquisitions by the community-based organization ownerships today, it'll tell us who our partners are, who else we should be, who's missing from this conversation. We learn what they own, how many units they control, and what their thoughts are, and what plans they have. Because don't forget, I guarantee you that half of them have plans for on the drawing board for their hotels and their property, which for affordable housing, whether it's supportive or SRO, other non-clinical, non-programmatic affordable housing. And it'd be great to know that. I think it's an important tool to have, and we have the rudiments of it and that good work that was done. And all research, certainly when it's dated that way, should be updated. If the basis, if the foundation is solid, and that is solid what this kid did for us.
I do feel like that's working within the framework of like the status quo is fine if the nonprofits are able to continue to do conversions now.
No, but we don't
Like-
know. We don't know. We don't know. We don't know much. We know a few good players that are very vocal and collaborate with us all the time. But you may have make double the number of not-for-profits that own property, own units, own hotels that we're not talking to, and it's all part of the conversation. And we need to partner. Part of our charge is to partner with other community organizations to reach the objectives that we're targeting. But we don't know. We have to find out, and this is the way you find it out. And they would welcome it, I'm sure. I don't know, but they would welcome it. You know, we send them a refresher. The notes, the archive would have whichever planning department at Furman, and I keep saying Furman because I think I have a lot of respect for them. And they would know exactly, and the students would just line up to do the work for us, as they would for any other community board that's offering them substantial projects that is useful to them and useful to the research in general, and usable to this fellow who visited us, and usable to other organizations that are looking to develop affordable housing. I think we have to do everything we can to add to the tool chest to develop affordable housing. And I think that's a part that we can do. That's a concrete product that we can produce for them.
Jeanette, do you want to?
Yeah, all good comments. I'm feeling a little, I don't know if it's pessimistic or realistic though. I think that any property owner of a hotel in the Upper West Side will always convert it to market rate residential if they have a choice, because they'll make the best money. And so I don't think we have much, I don't think there's anything the community board can do that's going to change the economics that would encourage, finding out who an owner is of a property or something isn't going to change their desire to make money off of that property. But I wonder two things. Well, I have three comments, but I wonder two things. One is, do we have some good examples? Because I think we do probably, that we could say, this is how it can be done, and it can be done where it's a win-win situation. Or this is really a great case where we have supportive housing, or we have a nonprofit, that's really helping. Maybe it's the 108th Street case or something. It could have been done better with this, or these are the things we learned from it. The other thing is, we could speak to our nonprofit partners and say, what are you looking for when you're looking for more places to do this type of work, to convert a hotel into residential, to affordable housing or such. And then just the final thing I want to say is that I'm a little wary to do some kind of a resolution or policy statement or something that affects the whole city, especially coming off of all the press that we got on the 72nd Street Hotel. I could just see the press eating that and being like, oh, the privileged Upper West Side doesn't want it in their backyard, but they're telling how everybody else should. On the flip side of that, though, I'd love to see us do something proactive that really shows where the heart of our community is, that we do want to help, make this a more livable community for everybody.
So what would that look like?
Well, that's why I think it might be better to focus on our own backyard and say, this works, or this is what's needed for our good players to expand their work, or something along those lines, rather than finding an inventory of, oh, we have 3 hotel owners who are thinking of converting their property. Because chances are, if those hotel owners are private sector, there's, we're not going to be able to dissuade their economics into making money on their property. That's what their incentive is for how they move forward. However, with the nonprofits, we can say, how can we assist you in making, in doing your work more efficiently?
Yeah, I guess my response to the economics, sorry, I know I'm speaking out of turn, is that if you could tie regulatory relief to a certain affordability or to other requirements, that could be a way. If there's no way that they could do a market rate conversion under current, because of the MDL or because of zoning, so maybe that would be a way. Ira, sorry.
Yeah, the device that you're talking about actually does exist. And whether it's effective or not is in its current form is another issue. But most owners don't care how they unlock the value of their property. They're in this for the business. So how they unlock that value doesn't bother them too much. There are a number of developers out there who talk about the double bottom line. There are relatively few, but there are some. And the way you can unlock this value, which has been in there in the zoning resolution for years, is that there has been the preservation option under inclusionary housing. I won't get into the details of how that works or doesn't work in the discussion we've got here. But if you could craft something that looked like an inclusionary bonus that was very portable and allowed you to perhaps even transfer over something off of an overbuilt site if you created permanent affordability and it wasn't just a marginal site to begin with, because a lot of these hotels are not marginal sites. You might be somewhere. That's somewhere to give somebody a chance to unlock that value and do some social good at the same time, which is a great opportunity, particularly if you can get it off the city's dime in doing it. And that's one possibility. It might be my broad strokes might be a little too geeky for the discussion here, but it's something you can talk about. I'm sure there's 1,000 reasons not to do it, but that type of mechanism does exist, and there are buildings that are done that way. And there are a lot of different bands of affordability as well, remember. And remember, we do bands of affordability well into the zone between 125 and 150%, as I recall. I can't keep track of it all. So I just want to say there are ways of doing this.
Louisa?
Yeah. Okay. I think if we're looking at doing some kind of zoning change, which is where I think you were going, we're talking about a long, long time because this would involve a lot of research. It isn't something that'd be done quickly. The reason why I was wondering about a survey of hotels is I just want to know what's out there. I don't know. I don't know what hotels really are on the Upper West Side, except the ones I sometimes walk past. So I don't think it hurts to do that. I think looking at the regulatory issues and seeing if possibly the idea of doing some kind of thing like a loft board and pushing for it is very interesting. But I am looking at something that would happen fairly quickly. I mean, looking at something that needs a lot of research and a lot of panels and a lot of people talking in many, many meetings, it's not something I'm interested in.
Yeah,
I think that we can actually deal with things right now. I don't think it's that difficult to do if we can kind of put together somehow a nonprofit, a building, and let them work it out and be there to help. But the thing is, I don't know what's out there first. And I don't think any of us do. We know which ones are in our very limited area. But I think that it can be done, and the regulations aren't even that difficult if you keep it to small studio apartments to start with. I'm talking out of frustration. You can hear that. I'm sorry.
I mean, I understand. I mean, if I was going to design the policy, I would agree. I would not go the zoning route because that's like the worst route. I would suggest something that just gets around the need to switch to, residential building code requirements when converting a hotel. That would be my answer. And that only allowing that exemption for affordable housing. But that's just my 2 cents.
So do we have any?
Well, I would request, Lisa, that we ask
Okay,
Michelle, that you and Melissa ask Michelle to dig up that report this kid did for us in 2012. So we can look at it and then see where it has to be updated. It's just going to be filling in certain fields, expand the number of properties, who the owners, which, and we're particular interest to Jeanette's question with the community-based organization ownership, the cohort that we know that we can work with, who would not betray their mission and suddenly go high price when the entire mission is affordability and caregiving and all of that. So I would want to get that. I would want to see that survey again. I may have it buried somewhere, someplace. Take me 2 years to find it. But
Roberta might know where it is.
yeah, exactly. Okay, so that well, let me put it a little more affirmative. I want to see that report.
Okay, we could find
So,
that.
right.
Building on something that Jeanette was saying, I would be curious to speak to the nonprofits that operate in the Upper West Side.
Yeah.
Do you think it's possible to get a meeting with them?
Oh, sorry, go on.
No, go on. I mean, it's just an idea that together, what are they working on? What suggestions do they have? I'd be interested.
Yeah, that's great. This would be our invitation list.
Yeah, so here's my thought on next steps. One is, like Mark suggested, like doing a little more research so we're more knowledgeable on the regulatory hurdles.
Right.
2, I think a conversation, and I don't know if these are separate or combined conversations, but with the local nonprofits in the room and with our state elected officials in the room, and to have, to kind of bring folks together to speak to what they see as the folks who actually know what they see as the barriers. And I think it's both hearing from the providers, like what they've encountered, and also hearing from like our legislators about like what the political challenges are. What if folks think about that for next step?
That would be a good learning experience.
I think it's a little premature. I think we need to do our work first. We need
And
to.
it also would give us a chance to read through, to circulate what they're going to send you and look at their report in more detail. The Furman Centers.
Yeah.
We can do that. Robert, you're going to speak to Michelle and Roberta and see what
Absolutely.
they can find.
I'll be happy to. I'll send a note first thing in the morning, if not 3 o'clock this morning.
Okay, so
We'll
sorry.
track it down. We'll track it down. Yeah.
Great.
So I think, I mean, the folks that would come to mind for me are Goddard, potentially Wisfish, Project Find,
Project renewal.
Project Renewal. Yeah.
A whole bunch of them.
And both the people at Project Find at Project Renewal and Wisfish have both private and public sector and nonprofit sector experience if you get the right people.
Can I throw in a word for Samaritan Village? They're not a big player in the Upper West Side, but they have some really wonderful supportive housing units that
I'm
would be a
sorry,
good
I didn't
model.
get the name.
Samaritan Village.
Yeah, I know.
Okay,
That's
thank
fine.
That's a good Samaritan, Louisa.
Yeah, but it's Samaritan Village. They have that place for new mothers on West 106th Street, over by the and it's the most beautiful thing you've ever seen, because the neighbors next door don't know it's there, and it's like completely surrounding care, everything from anyway, I don't want to wax too eloquent, but it's a great program.
Okay, so I think we can try to reach out to a few different providers, see who bites, and try to get like 1 or 2 to speak to us after we've done our research and due diligence, so we can have an informed conversation. And yeah, I don't know, maybe Louisa, you and I should talk offline about if that's something elected should be part of or not, or their reps.
Right.
You know, the timing is also good because we're going into semester break. So that the grad students coming in for, if it's still the same, January or February, would there be offered a good project?
Yeah, I don't personally have the capacity to try to work with an urban fellow or a student. I think that's also something that should go through the board more centrally and not something we can kind of just decide right now, but others
No.
might have more experience with this and want to weigh in.
Yeah, the committee, we did it in the committee, and I think other committees did the same thing. So look who's on this committee. You have Ira, you know, I know a little bit about this. You have Roush, you have who's another planner, and as we say in the movies, no sweat. And the people are credentialed, you know, so we have Roush has a MUP and that sort of thing. So we'll make her a supervisor. And that's the accreditation. That's the accreditation. Yeah, because it's all accredited work.
And unfortunately, I'm like Melissa, my time, I have limited capacity here. But I do have an item of new business when we're ready for it.
Oh yeah, let's move on. I think we have our next steps. I'll circulate the materials when I get them. We'll think about outreach to providers for January feels more realistic. So yes, new business. Janelle, let's go.
I don't know if this is something that the housing committee is interested in, or it's been talked about before, but our co-op board was having a meeting recently, and there's a number of people who are a bit older than me, but I'm certainly getting higher in age. But they were asking if there were like, I know there's NORCs, but I don't know, like, are there references to like what improvements a building can make that make it more accessible for an aging population? In other words, what would be like the first step for a building that wants to be more accommodating to its population as it grows? And one of the issues that we were discussing is so many co-op boards, I feel like a lot of what the improvements they're doing is for the end goal of making the apartments more valuable for resale. But if the goal of the co-op board was to make the apartment more livable for its existing residents, then some of the improvements might not be a roof deck, but it might be, you know, better handrails to get into the building, or ramps or something like that. And I was just wondering if I don't know if there's already resources out there, but if this,
Sure.
you know, we might want to, you know, maybe in the next year, focus one meeting or something on something like that related to making housing in the Upper West Side more senior friendly. I just happen to know a number of mainly women who are, getting into their last decades and live alone. I just think that our population has a community that could benefit from this, and this might be some kind of a resource, or at least a discussion that we could give to the community as a whole.
I agree with you completely. I think in my building, they're tearing down the nice, friendly gym and putting in Pelotons and heavy weight. I don't even know the name of these things. And I sat in a meeting and asked, you know, if it was possible that there were people who were older and people who were aging. And there needed to be equipment that they could use comfortably. My feeling very much at the meeting I was at, and I am on the board of directors and a former president, is that exactly as you said, a lot of buildings want to enhance the building because they think this will encourage higher sales. I agree with what you're saying, but I don't see how you can get past boards. And people can do things in their own apartment, but I have been suggesting things now, railings in the hallways. And believe me, they're going down with a thud. It makes me upset. But there's nothing I can do about it. And it's 25% of the, almost 25% of the Upper West Side is over 55, but you wouldn't know it.
Let me ask Jeanette a question. Is that because, I live in a co-op as well. The board is everything. And, there's a lot of legislation on overpowerful boards trying to stop that culture, but that's another matter. But the board is everything. What is the chatter on the board about the ideas that you're proposing, Jeanette?
Our building is smaller. It's just really 4 people and the managing agent. But they just all happen to be younger men. And so there's a number of older women who have been sort of talking, but the board, our board seems a little bit open to it. They did look at, we have 2 steps to like the mail area and then 2 steps to the elevators. We don't have a doorman. And those steps are a huge hurdle. And they did look a number of years ago at what it would be like, could they make it accessible? And they found that we don't have enough space for a ADA compatible ramp or something. So they just kind of dismissed it.
Right.
But I was saying there's other things you can do to make this building more friendly. And then they were like, well, we don't know what they are. So it would, I know there's enough discussion about NORCs and aging in place that the resources are out there. And I just don't know enough, like, where you go for that, or but I just, from my observations, and this isn't, Louisa says our population is indeed aging here in the Upper West Side. It just seemed to me like if I knew that information, this would be helpful to the community at large. But yes, every board on a case-by-case basis is going to have to decide what to implement unless there's building, department regulations or something. But for instance, I got my board after I fell and broke my elbow to put like these grit stickers on the steps in the hallway, which is a very low cost thing. And it makes a huge difference. I slipped, my foot slipped because it was a little wet on the marble. But by putting these little stickers, these strips of like sandpaper stick, that wouldn't have happened. And I think there's a lot of other things similar to that, yes, some of them are going to be long range projects, if you have to build a ramp or something like that. But I think there's also probably some, when they talk about like putting the handles in the bathtub or whatever, that's your apartment. But I think there's other things you can do. I mean, I pointed out to our board that we needed a bench in the foyer because older people are waiting for the elevator and they needed to sit down somewhere. So I don't know. I'm sharing my private problems with the board, but I just felt like it's something that the community at large might benefit from.
There are people who specialize in the area that you're discussing.
Yeah, my
And
thought
they're
are,
actually trying to make a living at it.
my thoughts are that happy to look at this. I think it should probably be with the senior task force, just for, I don't know, feels like their domain, but in partnership, and that maybe there's someone like Live On New York. They do like advocacy around senior issues and senior housing, and someone like them could be just looking into someone who could come address us and let us know what exists already in terms of like resources for buildings or best practices, that kind of thing.
And that's fine. My only concern there is that most of the people who pay attention to the senior task force are people who consider themselves seniors, whereas the housing task force is going to reach a larger audience.
Yeah, I would just say like, we'll make it a joint meeting, but do it like,
yeah, sure, absolutely. And Ira, if you could pinpoint some, we could get somebody to come and talk to us I mean, that might also help them because it exposes them if they, a co-op board wants to hire them or something, but they could share some of this information.
Yeah, I mean, I think the issue here is to understand what is possible. And I don't think the situation you're talking about, Jeanette, is trying to create an adversarial process, because there are lots of people out. I mean, I've been through this with, what is reasonable accommodation under ADA, and there are people who literally make a living out of pursuing ADA claims. And I don't think that's the issue here. The issue is how to make achievable improvements to people's lives in measurable time spans. And that's a different discussion.
Yeah.
And particularly in co-op buildings is a whole different thing than, for example, if you were trying to wrestle NYCHA into fixing a mailbox, where I've witnessed that. And I've been in situations where that's taken a half an hour of a council member's time in a room full of 50 people. That's not the kind of situation we want to discuss here. It's just what is realizable, what can we do, what's achievable.
Okay, so
That said, there's no reason why it could only be co-ops that, implement it, but yes.
Yeah, there was a person who came and did a presentation who I've worked with in the distant past, who is a principal in a housing office. I think she's still very active in the architecture and aging committee, the AIA. So that's an easy one for me.
yeah, if you can follow up offline with me and Louisa on that, and happy to take this on, Jeanette, early in the year. Cool. Any other new business or? All right, then perhaps we should adjourn. I don't know if motions are necessary, but.
All right. Good night, everybody. Happy Thanksgiving.
Happy
meeting. Thank you.
Thanksgiving.
Good
An
meeting.
interesting meeting.
Very good meeting, Lisa, Melissa.
Guys.
Bye.